Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So engagers, today we have somebody exciting and very special. It's Melissa. But Melissa, before we get started, we want to know, are you prepared to engage?
I am.
Yes, she is. I am sure of that. So, who is Melissa? She teaches English language arts in a small rural high school in Valentine, Nebraska. She's an advocate of innovation and gamified learning and also hosts the Games4Ed hashtag on Thursday evenings. She uses blended learning and coaches other teachers trying to integrate technology into their classrooms. In general, she's interested in anything related to literacy, innovation, technology, and how students learn. So absolutely right on the spot for today's podcast, Melissa. Did I miss anything?
No, I think that's it.
Fantastic. So, Melissa, we're always curious to know, what does a regular day for Melissa look like in today snowy Nebraska?
This year, as the past few years, I mainly teach 11th and 12th graders in a variety of English language arts classes. So we have an 8-hour period day, and I teach 6 classes, and I have actually 4 different preps. So that keeps me busy, and luckily I have a lot of technology that can help me out in staying organized. So I teach a couple sections of college composition, which is a college class, but then I also do some British literature, I do some English for the job world, and I also teach a section of theater and speech. And then with all of those, I try to do a lot of including of games or gamified elements to kind of prod students, help students engage in what we're learning. And on top of that, I also do coaching for our theater group and for our speech group. So it's a pretty busy world, especially when you're teaching in a rural school. But as much as I can, I try and do a lot of technology, a lot of games, because I really think that enhances the learning of all of the students.
I am completely convinced it does, and that's why we talk about these things often, and that's why your hashtag Games4Ed is so exciting.
Yes. I love hosting the Games4Ed. That's on Thursday nights. And we do a lot of conversations, obviously, about games, but I try to expand it too into just other playful learning, experiential learning. Last week we did a little bit of sketchnoting. Sometimes we do talk about, station rotation, and sometimes we really do talk about games or game elements. This last week we did games as a form of literature. What can make a game serve as a form of literature, or what games don't serve as a form of literature, and how do we use that in our classrooms to kind of capitalize on that for our students?
Absolutely. So, Melissa, anybody that listens to you having a Twitter chat and having all these things about games and gamification, all this time that you've spent on it, will probably think, Melissa's got it completely figured out. She never fails. She knows exactly what she's doing all of the time. And we want to make sure that everybody understands that even the people who are at the top of their game are checking things and are testing things out, and it doesn't always come out the way we're expecting it to, so to speak. So we would like to have a story of one of those times, Melissa, maybe your favorite one. What we would call your favorite fail or first attempt in learning when using games, gamification in your classroom. Can you tell us that story? Like, bring us to that time, and we want to feel it with you.
Oh, I'm going to bring us back to really the very beginning of my first foray into gamification, when I first went down that rabbit hole. And I want to say maybe it was 2014 when I first looked into gamification, because it just really looked intriguing. So I watched a bunch of webinars, read a lot of white papers, and I got everything planned out. I was going to pilot it with one of my classes, with my English to Job World class. And so I set out kind of the entire pathway that my students were going to follow. And I had set up all of the lessons and all of the assignments to go with it. And I had badges attached. And then when I did it, some kids at first were really excited. And that excitement probably lasted 2 or 3 days. And then after that, that all wore off. And I realized that sticking badges on assignments or just making games or making an assignment completely self-paced isn't the panacea that I thought it was going to be. I just expected everyone to kind of jump on board and this was all going to be great and wonderful. And I had a few kids right away who just went, well, this isn't a game. You told us this was going to be a game. And I saw that I had failed on a few different levels. I think one, I didn't have a lot of choices in there. And that's what games are all about. I mean, the most engaging of games have some sort of choice. And I had really very limited choices in this pathway. Two, not all students are going to be attracted to the gaming world. I mean, I think we need to realize that students play games or students engage with their learning for different reasons. Some engage because they like the social aspect, and some engage because they like to be able to explore and find new areas. And we need to be able to adjust to those. And I didn't have a lot of socialization opportunities in my game. And I think my major last failure was I had set it up to be so self-paced that I lost all connection with my students. I didn't have any moments of direct instruction or in conferencing. And I think that that's important too, that you need to retain those relationships. So, I mean, since then, I think I've learned more. I am definitely not a master, but I've learned more about balance of including games that help students learn, of creating some self-paced learning, but of also including direct instruction and including time where I can move around and conference with students and build those relationships. And so, yeah, I think my first failure was probably my biggest one, of just assuming that everyone was going to be on board and then realizing it wasn't just this magic pill for my classroom.
It is. And I think just as with gamification, I think most of the tools that can be out there that can be used in the classroom, none of them is, I don't think that there is a magic pill. And if we're looking for that, we're probably looking for the wrong thing, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And just more of the research with starting my doctoral studies this year, I think that that's probably one of my biggest takeaways that I've been accepting is that, I mean, one, there is no magic pill because every student, every context, every school is so different that there's not going to be a single solution. And, for everything that you do in the classroom, there's going to be some side effect, because I do games and I love doing games. And I think that builds up my culture. But I do realize by doing that, there's might be something else that I'm missing out on with my students. I mean, there's always a give and take in the classroom, and accepting that you have to adjust everything to make it work for that specific set of students that you have that moment.
Yes, that's completely necessary. And I think you nailed it down on all the key learnings that you had. So I'm not going to try to destroy that at all. I'm not going to make that attempt. Not this time. So Melissa, let's take a spin on that, and instead of going for that difficult or that failure moment, with of course a lot of learning that you had from that moment, and I'm sure there's many things that you're doing different now, and that we can learn from that as well. But what is another thing? I mean, maybe a specific class or a lesson or a session that you had, and you said, look, this is something that I want to use a game, I want to use gamification for, and it actually, for whatever reason or for whatever attempt that you had, it went absolutely great. It's one of those proud wall moments that you would like to share with us.
I've had, I really enjoy making games, and sometimes they completely bomb, and sometimes they turn out great. And a lot of times I find that the simplest games are the ones that turn out really good. And what comes to mind at this moment, and it was really just kind of a simple one day activity, was something just a spin off on dominoes. I was trying to work with some vocabulary words with, again, one of my school to English, my class of teaching English to those kind of heading into the job world or the military. And I threw together this game of vocabulary dominoes. And I used some cards from Apples to Apples game, and then I made cards with the vocabulary words on them and the vocabulary definitions. And we played dominoes with them. And what made it kind of fun and interesting was using those apples to apples cards where kids kind of had to think a little bit more outside of the box. And at one moment, one of the guys in the class, and these are students who are not interested in school, they're not committed to school or don't have a strong commitment to school. And one of the guys says, "Hey, this is a pretty fun, legit game. I mean, this is just fun to play no matter even in school, or that it was school related."
Even though I am in school.
Yeah, even though like we're learning. Um, but he was like, I play this just normally. And those moments are a win because at that point, I know that they're invested in the game. And because they're invested in the game, they're learning without even thinking that much about the learning. And, it's those moments and those types of games that I think are really the epitome of what we're trying to do with using games in the classroom, where the kids are so immersed in that flow and immersed in the game that they don't realize that they're also learning at the same time.
Sneaky learning is what I call it every once in a while.
That's a very true name for that, I guess.
It works every once in a while. So that I think we've heard both of your stories. I mean, from your starting point in gamification and games in your classroom, this story is absolutely fantastic. And one of the things I'm curious about is because you said you brought out together all these elements and you created your own game. So when you're creating a game for your class, or you're using, again, gamification, however we want to call it today, what's the how do you approach it? Do you have some sort of steps, a process, a mindset? How do you do it?
Usually when I'm setting up a game, I either start with a little bit of an idea, like maybe a spark of inspiration, or I just start off with a list of objectives, and usually that list is just one or two things of what do I want students to ultimately kind of learn from that game? What do I want them to get out of it? And then from that point, I try and form some kind of game, whether it's a game with cards or whether it's like a role-playing game. One time when we were working with fallacies with my college composition students, and I wanted them to get some practice with fallacies. So I decided just to give them a deck of cards, but this deck of cards had all kinds of examples of fallacies on them. I took some fallacies just off the internet, some poor argumentation, advertisements, and the such, and then challenged them to do a game jam, which is you guys take these cards and you have to make some kind of a game out of them. And then it just took off. And they all made different games, but they all met that ultimate objective of being able to kind of identify fallacies and, more importantly, identify fallacies that are out in our society and out in our advertising and on the internet. So for me, I think starting with that objective is important. If you're going to create some kind of a game where you want students to learn a specific concept from, it all comes back to what's that objective, and then you just build from there.
Absolutely. I think starting with the objectives is one of the center points of anything that you want to do, you want to achieve, because otherwise it's and not only starting by that, but also like coming back to it. When you're designing things, you sometimes get so excited in what you're building that you can easily forget that this has an objective, a very clear objective or set of objectives that you have, and they might be left a little bit behind. And always getting back to that, like having a big board in front of you that says, what I want them to learn here is to understand how fallacies work. Having that like very highlighted in front of you is, I think, something that helps very much when you're designing something, because you get into creative mode, you get excited, they start having a lot of fun with it. And it's, I don't know, I've found it sometimes difficult to not forget that you have to do it for a specific objective, and that they have to sneak in the learning every once in a while.
Absolutely. And sometimes, like you said, you get excited. And when you have an idea for a game, and I've definitely had games where I think that this game is going to be great, but it's almost like I'm forcing the objective to fit into this game framework. And in the end, I just have to accept that this isn't going to work. Especially if I get feedback from the kids where they go, wait a minute, why are we doing this? If I get that feedback and I have a hard time justifying it to them, then I realize, what, I might have a failure on my hands and I might need to put this game aside.
Or do another iteration as well, which is maybe use it for something else. I mean, I sometimes it's just dumping it around. It could be, but sometimes it's about getting that feedback and putting some different finesse on the final touches and the details. I did get some feedback on that on an escape room at once, and the detail was on how much time they were spending on the. I teach also in a graduate school, so these are a lot older. So the fun, they appreciated, they were happy about it, but then they said, well, we're here for a reason, and we want to make sure that we're taking that away. And they were taking it away. The problem is that I think that some of them were feeling that it was too much in the forefront, the game side and the mystery side of games, and it was not so focused on what they wanted to. So taking that balance, even if it's the same game, giving it a bit more of lesser difficulty on the game side and more difficulty maybe on the learning side is not an easy one, and it's something that you iterate on and that you get feedback and it can improve for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a good example of having to adjust to that audience. And sometimes we as teachers have to realize we need to do that, even from class to class. An escape room that might work well for this class might need a little bit more scaffolding for a different class. So it all comes back to knowing your students and knowing what they're looking for too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. So Melissa, what would you say after talking about all of these examples of your process, the way you approach this, what would you say is something that would be sort of maybe a best practice, or something that you would say that almost any person creating games for your classroom would benefit from? It could be a strategy, an idea, a way to approach it. What would you say that best practice is?
For number one, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is, games are not going to be a panacea. It's not going to solve all of your problems. What I usually end any presentations I do about games is that your curriculum, or whatever it is that you are teaching students overall, that has to be motivational and engaging to students in itself. If you have a dull curriculum, or if you have dull approaches where you're just handing out worksheets or having students listen to lectures and then answer questions, that is not a curriculum that can be enhanced very well by games. I mean, your curriculum has to be engaging in itself with essential questions and with ideas that make kids curious and wonder, because that's the foundation. And games are great for building culture. Great games are great for, learning and enriching and understanding those concepts. But if you don't have a good foundation of that curriculum, games aren't going to be the ultimate solution for you.
Yes, I completely agree with the fact that there's other things that you have to incorporate before thinking of whether it's gamification, it's project-based learning, name it, whatever it is
Mhm.
that you want to introduce. Sometimes you have to look at things that are more at the core of the subject itself. And even though, and again, I'm pointing the light at myself once again, because what I was teaching the last period is something around the realms of quantitative methods to business students who
Mhm.
were not exactly excited about learning that. They one of the things that I used to get them a bit more understanding of the importance of this is how it is used for other areas. Because when you get into a business, and that's one of the things that they ask me, when you get into a business, you have the marketing area, you have the finance area, you have the people in operations, you have the people in HR. You don't have somebody who is in charge of the quantitative methods inside the company, but you might have somebody who's doing the big data. You have the guy who's doing the financial, and all of these people are using the quantitative methods that we are teaching in this class to be able to do the other things that they're doing later. So that was one way to get them motivated about the importance of what they were learning, and again, getting a bit deeper down into the core of what it is that is being taught to them, and getting their imagination and a little bit of their excitement going on, even if just for the subject, not necessarily even for your gamified approach.
Yeah, Rob, I think you bring up a really good point there that I wish I would have said, but I'm so glad that you said it. It's, connecting how is what students are learning going to connect to their real lives. What is in it for them? How are they going to use this information? And I think you nailed it right there.
Thank you very much. I I think that there's many interesting things that we've been talking about today, and now it's time for a very difficult question, at least according to the feedback I get from most guests. And that question is, what is your favorite game?
Oh my goodness, yes. My favorite game that is on my phone, like I guess if we're going to go put in for amount of time spent playing, it would be Clash Royale.
Clash Royale. There you go. Good
Yeah.
recommendation for sure.
I, talk about a game that really adjusts to your playing style. And really, I mean, the people there, I have to admit, when I play that game, I'm like, gosh, these people know what they're doing to get me to keep coming back and playing more.
Yes, yes, and those are some of the things that sometimes people criticize games for using these tactics and strategies. But I do think that there's things to be learned from that, to be used in with a white hat on, doing it for
Mhm.
the greater good, and for some things that they actually want to learn. I mean, when people use gamification for, like, I don't know, like fitness apps, you don't download a fitness app because it's addicting to you. You download it because you want to get fit, or you want to go to the gym, or you want to go do running, or whatever it is you want to do. You do it for a
Mhm.
reason. So using these strategies to help you get on that path that you want to set out, and one of those is getting educated, understanding things about the world. If it's for a good reason, I do think that the ethics there have to be considered in many ways, but I think that it can be used very, very well, and can be very, very powerful for those engagement moments.
Absolutely. And I just got done reading a book by Csikszentmihalyi, and
Yes.
he talks about kind of something similar to that, we can get into flow for the good or for the bad.
Oh yeah.
And it's, all about choosing those effective and purposeful ways that are going to enhance our lives. And those are the things we need to get into flow with. And I suppose that can be, related back to the classroom. And we need to make sure that we are, using gamified elements in a positive way and not not just as a trickery to get kids involved, but in a way to enhance their learning and help them for the next steps in life.
Absolutely, it's not carrot and stick. And talking about doing it for the good and the bad. And you mentioned you're teaching, speaking as well, and you're part of the public speaking club. Public speaking was one of the main tools used by Nazis in Germany many years ago. I mean, you can't say public speaking is a bad thing. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, but it's been used for terrible things. Same as, I don't know, there's many examples there. So I love that comparison that you did there. But Melissa, now that we've been talking for a few minutes, well, a few minutes, more than a few minutes, I'd be guessing. After all these questions, getting all the vibe of this podcast, is there anybody that comes to your mind that you would like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game?
Some people who I never get tired of listening to, Steve Isaacs, Matt Farber, Chris Haskell, John Meehan, I think is just doing some really great stuff lately. He always amazes me. Adam Powley is another one who's just hitting it hard in the classroom and right on target with his students. Noah out of Israel, she's been doing some really, really great stuff too. I've watched her really grow over the past few years as she has started into this gamification and gamified learning and game-based learning. And she's really risen to the forefront over the past few years of that knowledge. So those would be a few recommendations of people I love to listen to, but also just people to follow on Twitter who really have a good grasp on the pulse of gamified learning right now.
Absolutely. And I invite you and many of our engagers to go back to, for example, John Meehan that you mentioned. He might be back because I know he's about to launch a new book. So he might be on within some weeks or maybe months. I'm not sure when is the launch, to talk about his new book. Stephen Isaacs was a recent one. Glenn Irvin, I don't know if you mentioned him. They were next to the other.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Glenn Irvin is fantastic as well.
Yes, absolutely. And many more that you mentioned that I hope to get on the podcast very, very soon. So Melissa, in that same sense of recommendations, and we all learn through many, many different mediums, but I think when we're in education, reading is always one of the main ones. And in that sense, is there any book, if you had to recommend one book, which book would you recommend and why?
If I could only choose one book, the best kind of just starter overview book of the whole gamified learning concept, I think, comes from Matt Farber. He does Gamify Your Classroom. He goes into game-based learning. He goes into gamification, maybe not as deeply as he does game-based learning, but he gives a great overview of all kinds of games for the classroom. And I have both editions of his book. And I hope he comes out with a third one someday so I can pick up even more games that he suggests, more techniques. So if you got to start somewhere, you can only have one. Gamify Your Classroom by Matt Farber.
That's a fantastic book, definitely. And talking about you, Melissa, now, what would you say is your superpower when creating games for your class?
My superpower would be risk-taking. Like, I'll try almost anything one time and just see how it goes. And, when I do that, I even just tell my kids up front, we're going to do something new today. I don't know if it'll work or not, but we're going to give it a try. And bless them, they usually just give it their all, and they're pretty frank with me at the end of, hey, this worked, or nah, this didn't work, we need to redo that. And I think that's the greatest power to have, is to have that ability with students to have them give their straight feedback to you, but in a respectful way of what works, what doesn't, when you're trying something innovative and new.
Absolutely. I think the whole risk-taking and play testing and checking things is the only way to learn if things work, because we can make a whole story in our heads of how it's going to pan out. And when it hits the ground, it doesn't work exactly as we were expecting it. So I think it's very, very important to have that superpower always present when we're creating for gamification. And now Melissa, we have this kind of gamified section of the podcast where we ask a random question that comes from our audience. So somebody or several people in the engagers are asking questions, and we pick some of them, put them in a list, and one of them is going to come out today. So today's question is, how do you make sure children are actually learning when you use games?
A couple of different ways. I suppose if it's maybe a vocabulary game that where the outcomes are easily measurable. The day after the game, we might do a quick quiz or we might do a Kahoot, a Quizzes. I call them daily challenges, where the kids answer some questions or they play an online feedback game where I can see which words are they understanding, which words they're still struggling with. If it's a deeper game, I'm going to give the example. Newsfeed Defenders is one we've been playing this semester. It comes out of iCivics, and it's a great game for identifying fake and biased news. And for that one, I think it's harder to measure because there is so much different learning going on. In those cases, I usually have students do some sort of reflection. Sometimes it's a written reflection. Sometimes it might just be a conversation to, tell me a little bit more. What do they feel like they've learned? What do they feel like they got from that game? And I think for those bigger, deeper games, the reflection kind of gives me a little bit more insight.
So it's basically what you're doing is checking whether I think it's a topic today of checking what you're doing and reiterating and going again and play testing and seeing if it's working or not. The way is to check. I mean, there's no other way. I mean, I don't think we can get into students' minds without asking them in any way, right?
Absolutely. And I think the more I'm in teaching, the more I think that we probably don't check with students enough. We do the chapters, we give them the test, and they fail the test or they pass the test, and then we move on. We as teachers need to do more conferencing with students and getting the pulse on how the students are doing, how they're feeling, where they're at.
Yes, I completely agree. I have to concur. But Melissa, as we were mentioning a few minutes ago, not too many minutes ago, a lot of time has been passing and we don't realize, but it's almost out of time by now for the podcast today. But I don't want to let you go unless you give us any final piece of advice that you want to leave us with. Of course, let us know where we can find you. Let us reiterate the chat that you're at on Thursdays, where we can ask you any questions. And then we'll say that for now, it's game over.
Okay. I guess last piece of advice, if you're just looking into getting into games, or if you've been in games for a while, and just take the risk. If you have an idea, take the risk. The worst thing that can happen, it doesn't work and you either reiterate or you put it aside and try something else. You can find me on Twitter at mpilikow. It's just my name, except don't put the ski on because that's too long. And you can also find me on my blog. It's technologypursuit.edublogs.org. You can email me at mpilakowski@vcsbadger.net. And of course, Thursdays, 8 p.m. Eastern time at #Games4Ed. We are always chatting something about games or gamified learning or just playful experiential learning as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for spending this time with the engagers, for investing this time in us. I'm sure that there will be many of the engagers also interacting some more, those especially those who are in the US or Latin America, that will be adding to that fantastic chat. Games4Ed, I've seen it many times, especially after the fact, post-mortem, so to speak.
Yes.
They're very, very good, very exciting. But for now, thank you again. It's time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it's fantastic to have you around. This podcast only makes sense with you, so
why not connect on Twitter so you can let me know of anything that you would like to ask, any important things that you're having around gamification, any doubts, any questions that you could have, anything we can help you with. You can find my Twitter account in professorgame.com/Twitter. I'm always sharing content, especially on education and gamification. But hey, don't click continue yet.
Do you want to know what's coming up with the Serious Play Conference? Then all you have to do is subscribe and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there!